Welcome. We're glad you've joined us today for this webinar on the draft Corporate Environment, Social, and Governance, or ESG for short, performance criteria for the EPEAT Eco Label. I'm Erica Logan, Director of Sustainability Criteria Development at the Global Electronics Council. Last week, GEC released its draft criteria on corporate ESG performance for a 60-day public comment period. On the webinar today, we're excited to share with you an overview of the draft criteria and the rationale behind it. We'll also give you a quick tutorial on how to submit comments and answer any questions about the criteria and comment process. Before we get started, just a couple of logistical items. First, the webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available following the webinar. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues. The slide deck will also be made available. Everyone is on mute today to reduce background noise. If you have questions, we ask that you type them into the questions window on your GoToWebinar dashboard. We will hold questions to the end of the presentations to make sure we have enough time to get through all of the content. But if we don't get to respond to your questions during the webinar, we will definitely respond by email afterwards. Next slide, please. There it is. I'm so pleased. Joining me on today's call are Rachel Simon, Björn Claeson, Jessica Evans, and Greta Barriger. Rachel is a senior manager for criteria development here at GEC and is our project lead for developing criteria for GEC's corporate ESG and our reduction of chemicals of concern sustainability impact areas. Björn is the director of Electronics Watch. Electronics Watch is an independent human rights monitoring organization with extensive global field experience that helps public buyers address and protect the rights of workers in electronics supply chains. GEC was pleased to partner with Electronics Watch to produce state of sustainability research for corporate ESG performance. Jessica is the director of the standards development team at NSF International, overseeing all of NSF's standard development efforts. And Greta is the sustainable standards lead at NSF, working on developing sustainability criteria in partnership with GEC. Next slide, please. So on today's call, we will cover a brief overview of GEC's criteria development process, corporate ESG state of sustainability research highlights, an overview of the draft criteria, information on how to participate in the public comment process, and next steps. So much to do in the next hour. Next slide, thank you. So before we dive into the heart of today's discussion, I'd like to provide a quick introduction to EPEAT and GEC's new criteria development process. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may be new to EPEAT, EPEAT is a tiered eco-label intended to spur innovation and move markets. For a product to even get on the registry, it must meet all of the required criteria. We call this the bronze level. And for a product to be considered silver, it must meet all of the required and at least 50% of the optional. For gold products, it's once again all of the required and 75% of the optional criteria. Next slide, please. The EPEAT program launched in 2006 with just one product category, computers and displays, and has now grown to cover 7 categories, 6 ICT product categories plus photovoltaic modules. Currently, each category has its own set of criteria and revision cycle, which is inefficient for all stakeholders, whether it's when participating in criteria development and maintenance, or if you're a participating manufacturer or conformity assurance body working to meet and verify criteria. Next slide, please. In GEC's new criteria development process, we're creating horizontal criteria focused on priority sustainability impacts. They will apply across all EPEAT product categories, starting with ICT products. There are 4 sustainability impact areas, including climate change mitigation, shown on the top left in green, which covers topics such as energy efficiency and renewable electricity sourcing. And then going clockwise are sustainable use of resources, or circularity, in blue, reduction of chemicals of concern in red, and then finally corporate ESG performance in purple. And that's a big S, as the initial focus will be on topics such as labor practices, social supply chain auditing, and transparency. And this is the subject of today's webinar. Each of these is a separate criteria development process. These criteria will be supplemented by product-specific criteria in limited cases. For example, criteria focused on toner and ink cartridges only apply to imaging equipment. These criteria are not covered in the modules and will be developed in a separate process. Now, on this slide, you see GEC's new criteria development process, kind of the big picture. Note that EPEAT is now recognized as a Type 1 eco-label. This new process was designed to align with the requirements of ISO 14024 for Type 1 eco-labels and to maintain GEC's commitment to developing criteria within a voluntary consensus process, which is important to many of our stakeholders. The process starts with, as you see on the left side here, state of sustainability research, which lays out the science and evidence to support criteria development. The research looks at sustainability impacts across the life cycle of the product, as well as strategies and best practices to mitigate the identified impacts, leading to recommendations for criteria. The state of sustainability research is open for public comment for 60 days. It's then revised as needed based on comments and any additional data submitted, and then published. For corporate ESG performance, the state of sustainability research was conducted by Electronics Watch. It went out for public consultation last spring, and the final version, shown here, was published in July of this year. It is available on GEC's website, and in a few minutes, Björn will share highlights from the research, but I encourage you to read the entire report, as it really contains a wealth of information. Based on impacts and mitigation strategies identified in the research, criteria drafting begins. Draft criteria may originate from different sources, including existing EPEAT criteria, if available and representing leadership. GEC staff or partner organizations may draft criteria, and we also welcome submissions from stakeholders. GEC then puts out a call for participation and forms expert ad hoc groups to provide technical feedback on the draft criteria, and if needed, draft additional criteria. For the Corporate ESG Performance module, we had 3 expert ad hoc groups working on different criteria topics, which align with each section of the criteria document. All the draft criteria are then compiled into a full draft criteria document, which is essentially a standard that is delivered to a technical committee, which is the consensus body that will deliberate on the criteria, modify it as needed, and ultimately approve the criteria by consensus. At this point in time, the draft criteria are also made available for public comment, and that's where we currently are in this process. The final step is for EP to adopt the criteria resulting from the voluntary consensus process. And to qualify for EP, a product will need to meet all of the required criteria in the 4 sustainability impact areas that I shared earlier that are applicable to the product. And if you would like a deeper dive into the process, you can download GEC's procedure from our website using the link shown here. We call it P74. And next slide, please. So briefly, principles for GEC criteria. When reviewing and commenting on the criteria, we ask both the technical committee and public commenters, all of you, I hope, to take into account the following 6 principles for EP criteria. Number 1, criteria must address priority sustainability impacts across the product life cycle. Second, criteria should establish baseline leadership through required criteria, but also incentivize continuous improvement through optional criteria. Third, criteria are to give due consideration to life cycle trade-offs and the ability of the market to meet the criteria in a reasonable time frame. Fourth, criteria should differentiate environmentally and socially preferable products from others in the marketplace. Fifth, criteria should align with internationally recognized best practices. And finally, it must be possible, super important, for the requirements to be independently verified. And now one more quick thing before I turn it over to Björn, I'd like to just touch on the implementation timeline for the new criteria. As we know, it's top of mind for many of our stakeholders. Since May, GEC has been engaging with stakeholders to solicit their feedback on the transition schedule for replacing the existing criteria with the revised criteria, as well as the timeline for launching the public EPEAT registry. This has really been a lengthy and thoughtful process. We expect the transition plan and overall timeline to be finalized in early 2023 and then made publicly available right away. So next slide, please. I'm now very pleased to turn it over to Björn, who will provide an overview of the state of sustainability research. Björn?
Yes, hi. Thank you very much, Erica. And I believe I have click control of the slides right now. I hope so. We'll see. So thank you so much, Erica, again. And Electronics Watch is very glad to work with GEC to support EPEAT criteria development. Let me see if this works now. Yes, great. So here's an overview of what I'd like to cover today. I'd like to talk briefly about the importance and also the opportunity for developing robust ESG criteria for the EPEAT Eco label. I'd like to talk about the core issues that we have highlighted in our research and also some of the mitigation strategies that can inform the, the criteria development. First, a little bit of a background for Electronics Watch for people who don't know who we are or how we work. We coordinate both the monitoring and remediation process of supply chain worker rights issues on behalf of public buyers everything from towns and cities and regional government and national procurement agencies to universities. And basically what we do is to help them all work together to protect the rights of workers in their electronics supply chains. There are three pillars of our impact model, and looking bottom to top on this slide. It starts with the development of the worker-driven monitoring methodology. So we provide training and tools to our monitoring partners who are civil society organizations located near workers' communities around the world. And we do quality control of their work as well. The public procurement part is that we provide training again and support for public buyers so they can better collaborate, coordinate, harmonize standards and processes. And we help them, and the critical thing that we do with them is to help them to follow up on the contract conditions that they have with their suppliers. And finally, the third pillar is that we work with companies in a structured and time-bound process, usually via the Responsible Business Alliance, to address issues that we find in public buyer supply chains. And we work here towards a shared goal of increasing compliance with international worker rights standards. Here's just a to illustrate the geographic scope of our work. The affiliated public buyers are located in 11 countries. Those are the greenish areas of the map. And then there's also an international organization that is an affiliate. And the brownish areas is where our monitoring partners are located, mostly on the manufacturing side, but also some on the mining side. Okay, so why develop these ESG standards and criteria? First of all, there are some real opportunities right now for strong, robust ESG standards. First, because there is a growing market for ESG products in general, and in part this is a result of the pandemic that taught us that resilient supply chains also have to be sustainable supply chains. Second area of opportunity here is that there is a conducive legal environment in many countries to strong ESG standards, where human rights and environmental due diligence is becoming mandatory in several countries in Europe, soon on an EU-wide level, and that forced labor bans are becoming more strictly enforced in countries such as the United States and in Canada. But of course, there's also a great area of need, not just opportunity, but need for strong ESG standards. And as Erica mentioned, we have emphasized the social in ESG because there's often a human rights gap in ESG tools. So there's an opportunity here, of course, for the EPEAT Eco label to help to fill that gap, and which is sorely needed for workers, of course, that because we need standards, we need criteria that protect workers' basic fundamental enabling rights, especially, and I will get to that in a moment. But also the climate crisis needs ESG standards to be resolved. We need an emphasis also on the social in ESG, so because we need a systemic approach to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. We need economic, we need environmental, we need technological, and we need social innovation to meet to address our climate crisis adequately. So that's a little bit of why and the opportunities that I think are the basis for this work. So let me go into our research findings. First of all, the freedom of employment is an issue that is common to workers across many different supply chain tiers and also across geographical boundaries. We developed a typology of forced labor that is based upon the ILO Convention 29 and our own fieldwork. ILO Convention 29 basically defines forced labor as work that is conducted under the menace of a penalty, and that is not, and where workers are not voluntarily offering themselves to do the work, but are basically trapped. So there are many ways that we have seen that workers workers are penalized if they refuse to do work, or they're trapped into doing work and have no real way of escaping their place of employment, even if it's an abusive place. I'll go over it very quickly. For example, students may be deprived of their diploma if they refuse to conduct internships. They're basically the same as regular work. Workers may sometimes aren't paid their last month of wages if they are exercise the right to resign from their legal right to resign from their job. They may get a poor evaluation or denial of overtime at some point if they refuse overtime when asked. They're trapped in many ways in their place of employment. There's debt bondage, of course, that's quite well known for the situation of foreign migrant workers, for example. Their workers are sometimes deprived of their identity documents, passports, and of course are then trapped in a place of employment in this way. Or they may simply be deceived in some ways into taking a job because they have been promised wages and bonuses that they in fact do not get, or they're not told about a work environment that may be that may be dangerous to their health. And so had they known about these conditions, they could have chosen not to take the job, and in this way they can also be entrapped to do work. So there are many ways that workers are coerced into working against their will. Let's see, can I, oh, sorry, I need to go, here, this is where I need to go. Sorry, I'm trying to forward slides here. There we go. The next core issue is freedom of association, and here you see I've put down anti-union discrimination, interference with the legitimate trade union, and lack of collective bargaining as the three issues that our ILO reports are the most common globally that have been reported to the ILO Committee on Freedom of Association. Complaints about these three issues are the most common for the ILO. These three issues are, of course, based upon the ILO Conventions 87 and 98 that established the fundamental right to freedom of association and collective bargaining. So basically, anti-union discrimination may involve workers being blacklisted or fired or demoted or transferred if they are supporters of the union, or they may see their they may have repeated short-term or temporary contracts, which makes it easier to fire them, even though they should be permanent workers by law. Interference is any act that is intended to promote the establishment of a trade union that is in fact does not represent workers but is controlled by the employer. And lack of collective bargaining is an issue. For example, if there's a trade union established and there's a lack of persistent effort by both parties to reach an agreement. So these are also quite common issues that we have seen. Then discrimination, or is the next issue. Basically, discrimination means to impair the quality of opportunity or treatment in employment or occupation. It is this is based upon the main one is ILO Convention 111 that prohibits discrimination on the basis that you see here, but there are other ILO instruments that prohibit discrimination on other bases as well. And perhaps the important thing to remember here is that there is, of course, intentional and direct discrimination that's quite easy to see. For example, we see it commonly in advertising of job opportunities for women or for people of a specific age. But there's also indirect policies that that are apparently neutral, but affect women with children, for example, or affect linguistic minorities in different ways, so they don't get all the benefits of that policy that other workers get. Occupational health and safety. I think the most common complaint that we see here is that workers don't know what chemicals that they're handling, and they could be quite toxic chemicals. Especially upper tiers of the supply chain here. They receive no information about it. They don't get training about how to use it. They aren't able to be consulted on their concerns about using these toxic chemicals, even though they may impact their health adversely. And they don't have a right to refuse to work with them. And what is important right now is that these are now fundamental labor rights. In the ILO Convention 155 is a core convention that gives workers the right to information about the chemicals that they handle, the right to training, the right to be consulted about these issues, and also the right to refuse work if that work presents an imminent serious danger to their lives or to their health. So these are very important new fundamental rights since the 10th of June this summer, in fact. Let's see, and then the final core issue that I'd like to highlight is the excessive use of flexible employment schemes or precarious employment schemes in the industry. And this is something that we see almost everywhere where we go. And it often starts with a business cycle that requires intense swings in short-term productivity by factories, so that they are in a situation where they have to find ways to easily bring a lot of new workers on board very quickly, or let the workers go very quickly. So we see a lot of workers having repeated short-term contracts, because that's easier to let them go if they're on short-term contracts, of course, when they really legally, in fact, should be permanent workers. We see a lot of illicit use of outside recruiters who not just recruit the workers, but also employ the workers. So workers in the same factory have actually different employers, technically. We see in countries such as China and the Philippines, extensive use of students to meet short-term productivity needs, where students, as I mentioned earlier, are technically interns, but really regular workers doing the same thing. And excessive flexible employment, precarious employment, has a number of harmful effects. On occupational health and safety, of course, it's more difficult to train workers that are really short-term, and health and safety is something that requires long-term training. Freedom of employment could become an issue when workers aren't actually allowed to legally resign because production demands are so high that the factory cannot afford to let them go. Freedom of association becomes an issue because it's easy to let somebody who's on short-term contract go if they're a union supporter, as I mentioned. And we also see a more hostile work environment often when there is excessive flexible employment. Violence and harassment tends to increase in this situation. So those are the issues. I want to go on to the mitigating strategies that we suggest. First of all, the first one is rather obvious, perhaps, that of course a company needs a code, needs audit protocol, needs a risk assessment methodology. But what we'd like to highlight here is that doing the auditing according to international and domestic standards, and paying particular attention to the fundamental ILO conventions, the ones on forced labor, child labor, discrimination, occupational health and safety, and sorry, what did I miss right now? Freedom of association and collective bargaining is absolutely key, and it's also important to do that auditing on high-risk facilities in all tiers of the supply chain. The reasons for that focus I've stated here: the ILO standards have international legitimacy. The fundamental conventions are in fact enabling rights. So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So if those rights are respected, that tends to ensure that working conditions overall are better. And of course, in higher tiers, the ones that are more hidden, they're often a higher risk there. So it's very important to go beyond just the first tier, for example. The next mitigating strategy that we suggest is supply chain transparency. And here we would like to suggest, and this is from a perspective of public buyers who are one of the main users, I believe, of the EPEAT label. That transparency requires transparency with respect to the factories where the product model that has the label is assembled, the main components that go into that model, and eventually also the mines that produce the key minerals that are used to produce this product model. And why is this? From a public procurement perspective, when they establish certain social or environmental criteria for their tenders, for the companies to meet, they must, by law, limit the application of those criteria to what they refer to as the subject matter of contract. In other words, the specific factories that make the specific factory product model that they happen to be buying. They can't tell a company that you need to apply these standards in all your, across the board. They can only say you have to apply that standard in those factories that make the product that we are buying. So the assurance that they look for have to specify specific points of production. A public buyer will not ever be content with just having aggregated data, even though companies may think this is useful, of course, to provide aggregated data, how they behave across supply chains, but that's not legally, technically sufficient for a public buyer. Now, the credibility of any label, of course, depends upon the quality of the monitoring and reporting on the compliance with the standards. And so here we'd like to suggest a mitigating strategy to be used is methodological transparency. How is the monitoring and auditing happening? What's the methods? What's the evidence? And what's the impact? And especially focusing the monitoring and reporting upgrade on the key issues that have reviewed the core issues. And we believe that many of these core issues require a stronger worker interview protocol. And so that is where we would suggest focusing the strategy of improving the monitoring process, stronger worker interview protocols. Let's see. We think there is a great opportunity for this label to create demand, to drive demand for remedy and remediation as part of the human rights due diligence process. And basically, you can look at the remedy as a rights holder or worker-centered view on corrective action. The question is basically, what is required to make workers whole, to compensate workers for harm that they may have suffered? Corrective action and remedy needs to go hand in hand. And the problem that we're seeing, of course, is that remedy is usually not included in the current paradigm of auditing and corrective action, though we have seen remediation in the area of compensating migrant workers for the fees that they may have paying. So that's one area of progress, clearly. But, you know, so there's a need for this from workers' perspective. There's also a legal demand for it because the remedy is required under human rights and environmental due diligence guidances, UN, OECD, and legislation. So it's becoming mandatory. So this is why the label, the eco-label, EPEAT eco-label now really has an opportunity to drive this issue and be in the forefront of this issue. Freedom of association, I want to highlight this as both a standard to comply with and a mitigating strategy. Because if there is genuine freedom of association, it creates conditions where workers can really help to improve their own conditions. And, you know, obviously that's a much more efficient system. If we can address the issues in the factory on a very local level, where workers resolve the issues together with, you know, with factory management, that's much more efficient than having a complicated supply chain strategy to address these issues. So, and what I'm saying here, I just want to illustrate with a picture. Basically, you have freedom of association. This helps workers achieve occupational health and safety. Social security, they get paid leave, it could be a less hostile work environment, and so on. And the final mitigating strategy that I want to highlight, where I think there's also a real opportunity for the eco-label, is to drive the living wage issue. I'm not going to go into depth on this, except to say that wherever we talk to workers in just about any part of the world, in any part of the supply chain, higher income, it's always listed on workers' priorities. So adopting this as a key mitigating strategy is a way, I think, for the EPEAT eco-label to be very responsive to what workers have been demanding for a long time. And I think that's what I have, and I really look forward to discussion coming at the end, I believe.
Wonderful. Björn, thank you so much. That was just incredibly informative. And with that, I'm also now pleased to turn it over to Rachel Simon, who will provide us with an overview of the Corporate ESG draft criteria. Rachel, over to you.
Great, thank you, Erica, and thank you, Björn, for that fantastic overview of our State of Sustainability Research joint effort. So let's get into the criteria. On this slide, we can see that there are 13 proposed corporate ESG performance criteria, which evolved out of the State of Sustainability Issues and Mitigation Strategies, which Björn was kind enough to provide an overview of, as well as the expert ad hoc group process, which Erica discussed earlier during GEC's criteria development process overview. So these 13 criteria are included in the full criteria document available for you to download. And out of these 13 criteria, 7 are required and 6 are optional. In section 7.1 on labor and occupational health and safety performance in the electronics supply chain, there are 7 criteria. These are focused on multiple objectives to mitigate infringements on human rights in the supply chain of ICT products, to promote a safe and healthy work environment, adherence to international labor agreements such as ILO conventions, and a decent standard of living associated with the manufacture of products. Section 7.2 is on environmental management systems. There are 2 criteria there, focused on minimizing the negative environmental impacts throughout the effective implementation of a comprehensive management system. Section 7.3 is on responsible mineral sourcing. There are 4 criteria there, focused on human right abuses and conflict affected and high-risk areas associated with raw material extraction and processing of minerals necessary for the manufacture of ICT products. So let's dig into section 7.1. A little over half of these criteria are focused on labor and OHS performance in the electronics supply chain. 3 are required and 4 are optional. These include manufacturer and supplier commitments to a code of conduct for labor conditions, such as upholding key ILO conventions, identification and auditing of high-risk facilities, transparency about audit results, such as non-conformances and corrective actions, and the suppliers a manufacturer is using, transparency about worker engagement, such as worker and worker organizations involved in the process, representation and remediation plans, access to grievance mechanisms, and details on how complaints or grievances are addressed. This also includes third-party certification to ISO 45001 for final assembly, whether owned by the manufacturer or outsourced. In the next section, 7.2, there are 2 required environmental management system criteria. These are requiring third-party certification to ISO 14001 for manufacturing facilities with responsibility for design and/or manufacture of EPEAT registered products. It's extending certification to final assembly operations, whether owned by the manufacturer or outsourced. And they continue to align with best practices for proactive management of environmental aspects. In section 7.3, there are 2 optional and 2 required responsible mineral sourcing criteria. Notable changes in these criteria from earlier versions of EPEAT include extending due diligence practices to cobalt, requiring sourcing of 3TG minerals and from responsible smelters and refiners, requiring that smelters and refiners be validated by programs approved as aligned with OECD due diligence guidelines, and criteria aligned with best practice strategies for responsible mineral sourcing and are supported by the State of Sustainability Research. So that is a very whirlwind overview of the 13 criteria in this section of Corporate ESG Performance. Before I turn it over to Greta and Jess, I just want to note that there's 3 levels of verification in the criteria document. This is at the product level, the product category level, and at the corporation level. So at the product level, this means that the evidence is provided for each individual EPEAT registered product. At the product category level, it means that evidence is provided, as it sounds, at the product category level, and manufacturers may indicate if the submitted evidence addresses multiple product categories. And finally, at the corporation level, this means that evidence is provided at the organization level and must address all products which the manufacturer has on the EPEAT register. I mentioned this because, again, these are in the criteria and will help interpret how the criteria are met to support conformance. So with that, those are the criteria in this corporate ESG performance set. And now I'll turn it over to Greta and Jess to discuss the public comment period.
Great, thank you so much, Rachel. So I'd like to provide some high-level details of what to expect over the next couple of months, and then I'm going to turn it over to Greta to talk more specifically about how to submit your comments. So the public comment period is open to any interested parties and individuals that are directly and materially affected by the criteria that we've reviewed here today. So the comment period will be open for 60 days and will run from November 10th to January 9th. And it will run concurrently with a technical committee balloting. So that has begun as well. And once those two pieces are complete, we will compile all of the comments and they will be integrated into the agendas and the meetings of the technical committee over the next several weeks. Once the technical committee has worked through all of the feedback that they received through both of those activities, a final report will be compiled and shared on the public space for all to view. And what that final report will include will be the comments that we received and the actions that are determined to address the feedback that has been shared. An important note is all comments that are included on the site are to be attributed to an individual and their organization. And so Greta will show where that information will be entered into the system. And as a follow-up to today's webinar, we will share the specific link for you to submit your comments, and please reach out to us if you have any challenges in getting all of your feedback submitted. So Greta, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everyone. I am happy to be here today. And as Jess said, just want to take you through a few screenshots of what the page will look like when you use that link on the last page to navigate to the NSF online workspace. So you'll land here at this overview page. At the top there is a link to download the PDF version of the full draft criteria document for your review. I also want to point out here in the description, there's some short instructions that mimic what I will tell you today, so you can reference them in the future. So to get started, you'll click the add a comment link in the top right, or excuse me, top left there, that's highlighted. And then on the next slide, you can see, as Jess said, some of that personal information that is required to be submitted with your comment, and that will attribute your comment to you on this public site as we collect comments. Then on the next slide is the rest of the form here and the details of what it looks like to submit a comment. So required fields are a subject, so just a high-level summary of your comment, and then your specific comment. You can also submit category, section, and item as identifying information, not required, helpful for a later organization of comments received. And then while proposed solution, the box there at the bottom isn't required, it is vital. So as you work through comments and are making suggestions, please accompany your comments with those proposed solutions. So those can look like directional changes you'd like to see and why, and also specific text you'd like to see changed. So please pay close attention to that and put your comments there. Sorry, back one slide. There's a couple of things I wanted to say there too. While the NSF online workspace page asks you to submit individual comments per form, you can feel free to bundle them. So you could bundle them by section or by criterion, and work through this form just once per those kind of groupings. Also, if you're having trouble with this page, please reach out to me. There's an Excel file I'm happy to provide that kind of eases in comment submission. And it's not shown here, but there is a way to attach a file to this submission. So that could be used for one reference document if you'd like to attach it, or if you go the Excel file route, you can attach it there as well. And then, yeah, just to bring us to close, a couple next steps, just to reiterate what Jess and I shared, the public comment process is open for 60 days now, and will close at 11:59 Eastern on the 9th, which is a Monday. Another link to submit comments there, and links for the draft criteria in the State of Sustainability Research for your reference. Any questions that come up about submitting comments can be emailed to me there. And technical comment questions or overall criteria development process questions can go to that general criteria email for GEC. So thanks, and look forward to looking through your comments.
Fantastic. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Björn, Rachel, Jess, and Greta. That was just great. We actually do have time for some questions. So if anyone has questions, please enter them into the chat. I'm not seeing any quite yet. Now I know our that probably means our speakers did a fabulous job, but I but I find it hard to believe that we wouldn't have any questions out there. And May, if I'm missing it, please don't hesitate to jump in if I'm looking at the wrong window. Okay. I do see one question here for Björn. Björn, are you still with us? I don't see your webcam. There you are. Björn, you mentioned that there's a certain level of transparency that public buyers require and need. And I just wondered if you could expand on that a bit more.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can just try to explain what I said, and if I'm not clear, then just tell me. And I think, you know, I operate, of course, primarily within the EU context. So the legal parameters for public procurement to apply social and environmental criteria are defined first by the EU Public Procurement Directive, that all member nations then have implemented in national legislation. So it's the directive and it's national legislation. And what they all, what the directive and the legislation is very clear on is that a public buyer cannot, for example, say to a company, you know, in order for us to buy products from you, you need to implement these and these standards across the whole supply chain, or you need to adopt this policy in general, right? They can only say to them, they have to apply the criteria I said to what is called technically subject matter of contract, i.e. the very product model that they're buying. So they can only say, look, you know, occupational health and safety is important to us, and we require you to uphold these occupational health and safety standards in these particular factories that are making the products that we are buying. So those factories could be in any tier of the supply chain, right? And so if a company then turns back and say, look, here's our CSR report, and this is how we deal with the OHS issues generally, fine, that could be interesting information, but it doesn't help the public buyer. They, in order to ensure compliance with their criteria, they need to have information about specific points in supply chain. They need to say, the company will need to tell them, this is what it looks like in factory X, Y, and Z that is making the products that you're buying.
That's very helpful. Okay. Yes, okay. Yes, and believe that probably addressed the commenter's question. So thank you.
I would guess that it is the same thing for any government or state or city purchaser in the United States, but maybe somebody else can address that.
Yeah, I mean, clearly the claims, while they may be at a product category level or a corporation level, as Rachel described, they need to, the evidence provided needs to be reflective of those products that are on the registry. Absolutely.
Right.
Is definitely the intent, for sure. Terrific. Well, my thanks to our audience and to our speakers today. Pleased to give everyone just a few minutes back, but let me say in closing, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. Later today, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to today's webinar recording and the slide deck. The email will also include links to the NSF online platform, the draft criteria, and state of sustainability research. Thank you again. Please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.